300 men tried. 300 men failed. Some lasted 2 seconds. A few made it to 4. One man, a former college linebacker built like a delivery truck, made it almost to 6 before the floor came up to meet him. Nobody made it to 10. The strongman had been standing in that California fairground for 3 straight days, taking on anyone willing to step into the roped-off square and try to survive a single, unscored confrontation against 600 pounds of trained mass. $100,000 sat in a glass case at the edge of the platform, untouched, gathering dust under the afternoon sun. Then a quiet man in plain clothes stepped over the rope. He didn't ask about the money first. He asked how the rules worked. 5 seconds later, the glass case had a new problem to solve. To understand why 300 men failed before Chuck Norris ever stepped over that rope, you need to understand what the strongman actually was, because the fairground posters undersold him. He stood 6'8". At competition weight, he carried just over 600 pounds, and unlike most men who reach that size through neglect rather than discipline, his mass had been built deliberately, through years spent on the strongman circuit, lifting stones, flipping tires, and pulling trucks across parking lots for prize money that, before this tour, had never come close to 6 figures. He had also trained, briefly but seriously, under a retired wrestling coach who specialized in turning enormous men into functional fighters rather than simple walls of muscle. That training showed. He didn't just stand there and absorb punishment. He moved with surprising economy for his size, planted his feet correctly, and knew exactly how to use his reach to keep smaller men from ever closing distance. The challenge itself was simple. Survive 10 seconds in the roped square without being knocked down, thrown, or forced to step outside the rope. No weapons, no biting, no eye gouging. Everything else was permitted. It sounded fair on paper. It wasn't. A man with that much functional mass, trained to use it correctly, generates force that the human body simply isn't built to absorb without specific, dedicated preparation. The 300 men who'd already tried weren't weak. Several were collegiate athletes. One was a Golden Gloves boxer with real hand speed. None of them had trained specifically to survive what they were walking into, and that gap proved fatal to their chances every single time. The strongman had grown comfortable with his own myth by the 3rd day. He'd started smiling for the crowd before each match, playing the showman, letting challengers get a little closer than necessary before ending things, because the crowd liked the drama, and the drama sold tickets to the rest of the fair. He had no specific reason to expect the quiet man in plain clothes would be any different. Norris was 35 years old that year, deep into the tournament dominance that had made his name inside serious martial arts circles, though his film career hadn't yet exploded into the cultural force it would become within a few more years. He was in California for an unrelated appearance, heard about the fairground challenge from a training partner who'd gone to watch out of curiosity, and decided to see it for himself. He watched 4 challengers fail in a row before he made up his mind. He noticed things the crowd didn't. The strongman planted his lead foot a half-second before every committed push. He favored his right side slightly when pivoting. He used his reach to control distance, but his hips were slow to reset once he'd fully extended. None of that information would have mattered to most of the 300 men who'd already tried. It mattered enormously to a man who'd spent 18 years studying exactly how bodies move and fail to move.
Norris walked to the edge of the platform and asked the promoter running the booth a simple, practical question. What exactly counted as being forced outside the rope? A push, a throw, or did losing your balance and stepping back voluntarily count the same way? The promoter, slightly thrown by the specificity of the question after 3 days of challengers who'd mostly just signed the waiver and walked in swinging, explained the rule clearly. Any part of both feet crossing the rope line, by any means, ended the match in the strongman's favor. Norris nodded once and signed the waiver. The crowd, sensing nothing different about this challenger than the last 4 who'd gone down hard, settled into the same restless anticipation that had carried them through the entire afternoon. A few people laughed quietly at how unremarkable he looked standing next to a man nearly twice his height. The strongman barely glanced at him as he stepped into the square. He'd developed a habit, by this point in the tour, of sizing up challengers in about half a second and adjusting his showmanship accordingly. This one didn't look athletic in any obvious way. No visible muscle mass to speak of. Plain clothes, calm face, hands loose at his sides instead of raised in the exaggerated guard most amateur challengers struck for the crowd's benefit. He smiled at the audience, the same practiced smile he'd used for 2 days straight, and gestured for someone to start the clock. The clock started. The strong man moved first, the same opening he'd used against nearly every challenger that week, a controlled forward push designed to test reaction time before committing to anything more decisive. Norris wasn't where the push was aimed. A small lateral shift, barely visible from the crowd's angle, put him just outside the strong man's extended reach. The big man's hand closed on empty air where a chest should have been. The crowd's murmur shifted, just slightly, into something closer to attention. The strong man recalibrated fast for a man his size. He'd faced fakes and feints before, mostly clumsy ones from nervous amateurs who telegraphed every movement a full second in advance. This felt different, though. He couldn't yet articulate why. He came again, faster this time, both hands aiming for a controlling grip on Norris's shoulders. The same setup that had ended at least 60 matches that week with a single decisive shove.
What happened in the next 5 seconds would become, among the people who saw it clearly, the single most retold story from that entire summer fair circuit. Norris let the strongman's hands nearly reach him before moving again, not retreating, stepping inside the extending arms into the specific dead zone close to a much larger man's body, where his reach advantage stopped mattering and his slower hip reset became the only thing left to exploit. The strongman felt the distance change before he understood what it meant. His hands found shoulders that weren't fully there anymore, his weight already committed forward into a push that had nothing solid left to push against. For a fraction of a second, 600 pounds of trained mass was leaning into empty space. Norris used that exact moment, the strongman's own forward momentum already working against his base, and applied a short, precisely placed redirect against the big man's extended arm. Not a punch, not a strike meant to injure, a controlled, surgical adjustment to a structure that had already been compromised by its own commitment. The strongman's lead foot, the same foot he planted a half-second early on every single push, lost its anchor. He staggered. Not a full fall, not yet, but the specific alarming lurch of a body's 600 pounds had briefly stopped cooperating with the ground beneath it. The crowd went audibly quiet, the specific hush of 300 people simultaneously recalculating what they thought they understood about what they were watching. 3 seconds had passed. The strongman, to his credit, fought to recover. He widened his stance, dropped his center of gravity, tried to reset the fight on his own terms before the clock ran out. He never got the chance. Norris, already inside his guard, used the strongman's own recovery motion, the wide repositioning of his back foot, as the final opening. A second controlled redirect, this one against the hip rather than the arm, met a structure that was already mid-transition and had no stability left to resist with. The strongman's back foot crossed the rope. Both feet, fully outside the line, less than 5 seconds after the clock had started. The fairground went completely silent. Then it didn't. The crowd's noise came back all at once, a confused, overlapping wave of disbelief and applause that took several seconds to settle into something coherent. People who'd been half paying attention all afternoon were suddenly leaning forward, asking the people next to them what exactly had just happened, because it had happened too fast and too cleanly for most of them to fully process in real time.
The strong man stood at the edge of the square, both feet planted outside the rope, his chest still heaving from the brief, intense exertion of trying to recover a position that had already collapsed beneath him. He looked at Chuck Norris for a long moment. Then, in front of the entire crowd, he extended his hand. Norris shook it. The promoter, visibly uncomfortable with the math suddenly facing him, opened the glass case and counted out the bills with the careful, reluctant precision of a man who genuinely never expected to perform that exact task. The crowd watched the transaction in something close to reverent silence, the specific quiet that follows witnessing a thing you weren't sure was actually possible. Norris took the money without ceremony, folded it once, and slid it into his jacket pocket. He didn't say anything to the crowd. He didn't pose for photographs or linger to enjoy the attention. He simply stepped back over the rope and walked off toward the parking lot, the same quiet, unremarkable man who'd asked a practical question about the rules less than 2 minutes earlier. The strongman finished his tour that summer with his reputation somehow more intact than damaged. People who heard the story afterward tended to focus less on his loss and more on the specific surgical efficiency of how it happened. The sense that he hadn't been beaten through brute force, but through something closer to physics being explained to him directly. He continued competing on the strongman circuit for several more years, eventually shifting his training to include more grappling and balance work, a change his training partners attributed directly to that single afternoon in California. He never publicly named the man who'd taken his $100,000. In interviews given years later about his competitive career, he referenced the incident only obliquely, describing a moment when he learned that size buys you a lot, but it doesn't buy you everything.
Here's what that afternoon actually demonstrated, once people had time to think it through rather than simply react to it. The strongman's size and trained mass were never in question. 300 failed challengers had already proven decisively exactly how dangerous he was to anyone without specific preparation to meet him. His reputation wasn't built on hype, it was earned repeatedly against real opposition. What the 5 seconds proved instead was something that runs through every story like this one. That raw mass, however dominant in most circumstances, has specific structural vulnerabilities that only become visible to someone who has spent years studying exactly how bodies generate, transfer, and lose force. Norris never spoke publicly about the Fairground Challenge in any interview connected to his career. By this point, it had become an established pattern, the quiet test, taken seriously, absorbed into his own ongoing development without any specific need to publicize what had happened or why. He had been offered a genuine public test against one of the most physically dominant men 300 prior challengers had ever faced. He had answered it honestly, using exactly enough technique to settle the question cleanly. And then he had gone home, with the only proof that mattered, folded quietly in his jacket pocket.
Here's what that afternoon actually demonstrated, once people had time to think it through rather than simply react to it. The strongman's size and trained mass were never in question. 300 failed challengers had already proven, decisively, exactly how dangerous he was to anyone without specific preparation to meet him. His reputation wasn't built on hype, it was earned, repeatedly, against real opposition. A California fairground, a 600-pound strongman who had already beaten 300 men without serious difficulty, and $100,000 sitting untouched in a glass case until a quiet stranger asked a practical question about the rules. 5 seconds, no strikes meant to injure, no dramatic confrontation, just precise structural redirection applied at exactly the right moment against a man whose own forward momentum did most of the work. The strongman shook his hand afterward, genuinely, without resentment, because he understood, in the specific way that serious competitors always eventually understand, that he hadn't been beaten by anger or luck. He'd been beaten by 18 years of preparation, meeting 5 seconds of opportunity, and there was nothing to be bitter about in that. He was 35 years old at that fairground. He had been training since 1958. He had never specifically trained to fight a 600-pound strongman. He had simply trained deeply enough, broadly enough, for long enough, that when the moment arrived, what he carried inside 18 years of structural understanding was more than sufficient to answer it.